Hey there, and welcome back to another deep dive into the shadowy corners of history. Before we begin tonight's journey, hit that subscribe button if you genuinely enjoy these explorations into the past, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. It's always fascinating to see this community spanning across time zones, all united by our curiosity about the darker chapters of human history. Now, settle in, maybe dim those lights, and let's step into a world where suspicion lurked behind every wooden door and accusations could spread faster than wildfire through thatched roof villages. Tonight, we're exploring something that might make you grateful you weren't born a few centuries earlier. Because if you think cancel culture is intense now, wait until you hear about medieval witch hunts. Picture this. You're living in a small European village, sometime between the 14th and 17th centuries. The plague has ravaged communities, crops are failing, and everyone's looking for someone to blame. Your neighbor's cow mysteriously dies. A child in the village develops a fever. The local lord's wife has a miscarriage. And suddenly, fingers start pointing in your direction. Why? Well, you might have committed the unforgivable sin of being a woman who knew how to read. Or maybe you owned a cat. Perhaps you were caught talking to yourself while gathering herbs. Congratulations, you're now a prime candidate for accusation of witchcraft. What I'm about to share with you are 25 actual reasons that could have gotten you branded as a witch during the height of the witch craze. And trust me, some of these will absolutely shock you with their absurdity. We're talking about an era when being too knowledgeable, too independent, or simply too different could literally cost you your life. This isn't just a list of random medieval paranoia. These are documented reasons pulled from actual trial records, Inquisition documents, and historical accounts of witch accusations across Europe and colonial America. By the end of this exploration, you'll understand not just how truly bizarre these accusations were, but how they reveal the deep-seated fears, prejudices, and social tensions that defined medieval and early modern society. You'll see how witch hunts were never really about magic at all, but about control, scapegoating, and the dangerous power of mass hysteria. So let's begin our countdown of the most ridiculous, tragic, and utterly bewildering reasons you could have been accused of witchcraft. And fair warning, some of these might hit closer to home than you'd expect. Asterisk, asterisk, reason. 25. You were a midwife or healer. Asterisk, asterisk. Let's start with one of the most common and tragic accusations. If you were a woman who helped deliver babies or treated the sick with herbal remedies, you were walking a dangerous tightrope. Midwives were essential to medieval communities, yet they were also viewed with deep suspicion. Why? Because they dealt with the mysteries of life and death, had intimate knowledge of women's bodies, and possessed skills that seemed almost magical to the average person. When a birth went wrong or a patient died despite treatment, the midwife became an easy target. Historical records show that midwives were accused of everything from causing stillbirths to cursing newborns. In some regions, they were required to take special oaths swearing they weren't witches, and in others, they were banned from practicing altogether during particularly intense periods of witch hysteria. The irony is devastating. The very women who dedicated their lives to helping others were often the first to be condemned when things went wrong. Their knowledge of herbs, anatomy, and healing practices, skills that should have been celebrated, instead marked them as suspicious in a world that feared female expertise. Asterisk, asterisk, reason. 24. You owned too many cats. Asterisk, asterisk. Yes, you read that correctly. Having multiple cats, or even just one particularly affectionate feline, could mark you as a witch. Cats, especially black ones, were believed to be familiars, demonic spirits in animal form that assisted witches in their evil work. But here's the absurd part. Any unusual behavior from your cat could be used as evidence against you. Did your cat seem to understand you too well? Clearly, it was your familiar receiving instructions. Did it disappear for days and then return? Obviously, it was off doing witchcraft errands. Was it particularly good at catching mice? Well, that was suspiciously supernatural hunting ability. The poor creatures that actually helped medieval communities by controlling rodent populations became symbols of evil. Women who lived alone and kept cats for companionship were especially vulnerable. In a society that expected women to be married and under male authority, a woman living independently with only cats for company was already viewed as unnatural. Add the superstitions about felines, and you had a perfect storm of accusation. Asterisk, asterisk, reason. 23. You were caught reading or writing. Asterisk, asterisk. In an era when literacy rates hovered around 10% and were even lower for women, the ability to read and write was viewed with suspicion. Knowledge was power, and power in the wrong hands was dangerous. Women who could read were often accused of studying grimoires, spell books, or other forbidden texts. But it gets worse. Even being caught with any book could be problematic. Religious texts might be acceptable, but anything else could be deemed suspicious. Mathematical calculations, medical notes, even personal letters could be interpreted as magical formulas or communications with dark forces. The fear of literate women was so intense that in some communities, teaching a woman to read was itself considered potentially dangerous. After all, if she could read, she might access knowledge that was meant to be restricted to men and clergy. This created a vicious cycle where education itself became a mark of suspicion. Asterisk, asterisk, reason. 22. You had red hair. Asterisk, asterisk. Physical appearance played a huge role in witch accusations, and redheads were particularly vulnerable. Red hair was associated with fiery tempers, sexual impropriety, and demonic influence. The prejudice was so strong that red-haired individuals were often assumed to have inherited their coloring from demonic ancestors. This wasn't just casual prejudice, it was documented in legal proceedings. Trial records from various European countries show that having red hair was frequently mentioned as supporting evidence in witchcraft cases. Prosecutors would point to a defendant's red hair as proof of their unnatural and potentially evil nature. The association became so entrenched that red-haired women learned to cover their hair completely in public. Some even went so far as to dye their hair darker colors, using dangerous substances that often caused hair loss or scalp damage. The fear was that women were willing to risk their health to avoid the suspicion that came with their natural appearance. Asterisk, asterisk, reason. 21. You were left-handed, asterisk, asterisk. Being left-handed in medieval times wasn't just inconvenient, it was potentially deadly. The left hand was associated with the sinister, literally, that's where the word comes from, and with evil. Left-handed people were thought to be marked by the devil or naturally inclined toward dark practices. Churches taught that the left side was the devil's side, while the right was God's side. This wasn't just metaphorical, it was taken quite literally. Left-handed people were forced to learn to write and eat with their right hands, not just for social conformity, but to avoid accusations of being influenced by evil forces. In witch trials, being left-handed was often mentioned as circumstantial evidence of guilt. Witnesses would testify about seeing the accused person favor their left hand, as if this natural trait was proof of supernatural corruption. Some trial records even describe attempts to determine a person's true nature by observing which hand they instinctively used when startled or under stress. Asterisk, asterisk, reason. 20. You were too beautiful or too ugly, asterisk, asterisk. Here's where the impossible standards really become clear. Women could be accused of witchcraft for being either exceptionally beautiful or notably unattractive. Beautiful women were suspected of using magic to enhance their appearance or of seducing men through supernatural means. Their beauty was seen as unnatural, a tool of temptation and corruption. On the flip side, women considered ugly were thought to have been marked by their evil practices or to have been rejected by God's grace. Physical deformities, scars, birthmarks, or simply unconventional features could all be interpreted as signs of witchcraft. It was a no-win situation where any deviation from a narrow standard of acceptable appearance could trigger suspicion. The documentation of these accusations reveals the impossible position women found themselves in. Trial records show cases where a woman's beauty was cited as evidence that she had made a pact with the devil to enhance her appearance, while in other cases, a woman's plain or unusual features were presented as proof that she had been physically marked by evil forces. Asterisk, asterisk, reason. 19. You were seen talking to animals, asterisk, asterisk. So, medieval people believed that witches could communicate with animals, particularly with their familiars. If you were caught talking to your livestock, pets, or even wild animals, this could be interpreted as evidence of supernatural communication. Farmers who spoke to their cattle while milking, women who cooed to their chickens while collecting eggs, or anyone who seemed to have an unusual rapport with animals became suspects. The accusations became even more absurd when they extended to normal animal behavior. If your horse seemed particularly obedient, if your dog always came when called, or if birds seemed drawn to your garden, these natural occurrences could be twisted into evidence of magical influence. Some trial records describe elaborate theories about how accused witches supposedly gave instructions to their animal familiars. Prosecutors would claim that seemingly innocent conversations with pets were actually coded commands for carrying out evil missions. The paranoia was so intense that many people stopped speaking to their animals altogether, leading to a strange period where natural human-animal bonding became viewed as potentially dangerous. Asterisk, asterisk, reason. 18. You knew too much about weather patterns. Asterisk, asterisk. Farmers and sailors who had developed expertise in predicting weather changes often found themselves under suspicion. The ability to forecast storms, droughts, or favorable growing conditions was seen as potentially supernatural rather than the result of careful observation and experience. Women who warned their neighbors about coming bad weather, or who seemed to know when to plant or harvest for best results, could be accused of controlling the weather through magical means. This was particularly tragic because such knowledge was often crucial for community survival, yet those who possessed it risked persecution for sharing it. The accusations became especially intense during periods of unusual weather. Droughts, floods, unseasonable frosts, or destructive storms were often blamed on witches, and anyone who had predicted or seemed to anticipate these events became a prime suspect. Some communities literally drove out their most knowledgeable farmers and weather watchers, then suffered the consequences of losing that crucial expertise. Asterisk, asterisk, reason. 17. You had an unusual birthmark or scar. Asterisk, asterisk. Physical marks on the body were scrutinized intensely during witch trials. Birthmarks, scars, moles, or any unusual skin features could be interpreted as devil's marks or witches' marks. These were believed to be spots where the devil had touched a person or where familiars had sucked blood. The examination for these marks became a standard part of witch trials, with accused individuals being stripped and thoroughly searched by appointed examiners. Any unusual marking could be declared evidence of guilt, and the interpretation was entirely subjective. Add suspicious in one case while being overlooked in another, depending entirely birthmark might be deemed most disturbing, was how common skin conditions on the bias of the examiners, perhaps in pigmentation, were transformed into evidence of supernatural scars from accidents or natural variations corruption. People learned to hide any unusual marks on their bodies, wearing clothing that covered every inch of skin to avoid giving accusers ammunition. Asterisk, asterisk. Reason 16 is proportionately targeted in witch hunts. And the you were widowed, asterisk, asterisk. Widows' wordy reasons reveal the deep misogyny of the era. A woman without a husband was seen as unnatural and potentially dangerous. She had no male authority figure to control her actions, which made her suspect in a society that believed women needed constant masculine supervision. Widows often inherited property, which made them economically independent and therefore threatening to the established order. They might have knowledge of their deceased husband's business dealings, medical practices, or other specialized information that seemed suspicious when possessed by a woman alone. The timing of accusations against widows was often telling. Many were targeted shortly after their husband's death, when the community was looking for someone to blame for various misfortunes. Others faced accusations years later when their independence had made neighbors uncomfortable or when their property became attractive to others who might benefit from their removal. Asterisk, asterisk. Reason. 15. You brewed beer or made herbal remedies. Asterisk, asterisk. The medieval brewing industry was dominated by women, known as brewsters, who created ale and beer for their communities. But here's where things get twisted. The process of fermentation seemed magical to people who didn't understand the science behind it. How could simple grains and water transform into something that could alter consciousness. Clearly, supernatural forces were at work. Women who were particularly skilled at brewing, whose ale tasted better or lasted longer than others, found themselves under scrutiny. If a batch went bad, they might be accused of deliberately cursing it. If it was too good, they must have used magical enhancement. The large wooden paddles used for stirring became associated with witches' staffs, and the bubbling cauldrons looked suspiciously like what people imagined witches used for potion making. Herbal remedies fell under similar suspicion. Women who knew which plants could ease pain, reduce fever, or treat infections were walking a dangerous line. Their knowledge of botany and medicine, gained through generations of female tradition, was reinterpreted as dark magic. The very herbs that saved lives became evidence of supernatural knowledge that must have been gained through demonic instruction. Asterisk, asterisk. Reason. 14. You were seen, dancing or singing alone. Asterisk, asterisk. Personal expression, particularly by women, was viewed with deep suspicion. If you were caught dancing alone in your home, garden, or while working, this could be interpreted as performing ritual movements or celebrating with invisible demonic forces. Singing to yourself while doing chores was seen as potentially chanting spells or communicating with spirits. The paranoia extended to any form of solitary enjoyment. Women who seemed too happy, who hummed while working, or who moved rhythmically while grinding grain or spinning wool, could find themselves accused of supernatural celebration. The idea that someone might simply enjoy music or movement for its own sake was apparently incomprehensible to accusers who saw sinister motives in the most innocent activities. Trial records document cases where neighbors testified about hearing accused women singing at unusual hours, or seeing them move in ways that seemed too graceful or coordinated. The natural human tendency to sing or sway while working was transformed into evidence of otherworldly influence. Asterisk, asterisk, reason. 13. You had prophetic dreams or nightmares. Asterisk, asterisk, dreams were taken very seriously in medieval times, seen as messages from God, warnings from angels, or communications from demons. If you had vivid dreams that seemed to predict future events, or if you experienced particularly intense nightmares, you could be accused of supernatural communication. Women who dreamed about upcoming deaths, accidents, or disasters, and then saw those events come to pass, were especially vulnerable. Even if their dreams were simply coincidental or based on subconscious observations of warning signs, they were interpreted as proof of supernatural foreknowledge. The ability to have prophetic dreams was seen as evidence of a pact with dark forces. Nightmares were equally dangerous. If you cried out in your sleep, talked about demons or monsters, or woke up in distress, neighbors might interpret this as evidence that you were being visited by evil spirits or participating in supernatural activities during sleep. Some accusations were based entirely on reports of what someone had said or done while dreaming. Asterisk, asterisk, reason. 12. You were too interested in books or learning. Asterisk, asterisk. Intellectual curiosity was deeply suspect, especially in women. If you showed too much interest in reading, asked too many questions about natural phenomena, or demonstrated knowledge beyond what was considered appropriate for your gender and social status, you risked accusation. The pursuit of knowledge was seen as potentially dangerous, a way of accessing forbidden information. Women who collected books, even religious ones, were viewed with suspicion. A personal library could be interpreted as a collection of spell books or grimoires. Mathematical calculations, astronomical observations, or medical notes could all be seen as evidence of supernatural study. Even keeping detailed household records might be viewed suspiciously if they were too organized or comprehensive. The fear extended to teaching others. Women who instructed children in reading or arithmetic, or who shared knowledge about practical skills like medicine or agriculture, could be accused of spreading dangerous information or corrupting young minds with forbidden knowledge. Asterisk, asterisk. Reason 11. You were seen gathering herbs at night. Asterisk, asterisk. Herbalism was a necessary skill for medieval women, but the timing and manner of plant gathering could trigger suspicion. Many herbs were believed to be most potent when collected at specific times, including during certain moon phases or at night. Women who understood these traditional practices and gathered plants during optimal times could be accused of performing magical rituals. Night gathering was particularly suspicious because it suggested secrecy and association with darkness. Even though many plants were traditionally harvested at dawn or dusk for practical reasons, such as higher moisture content or stronger scent, accusers interpreted these practices as evidence of supernatural activity. The knowledge of which plants to gather, when to harvest them, and how to prepare them for maximum effectiveness was passed down through generations of women. This ancient wisdom, essential for community health and survival, became twisted into evidence of witchcraft when communities were looking for scapegoats. Asterisk, asterisk, reason. 10. You argued with your neighbors. Asterisk, asterisk, social conflict could quickly escalate into witchcraft accusations. If you had disputes with neighbors over property boundaries, borrowed tools, or community responsibilities, and unfortunate events subsequently befell your opponents, you might find yourself accused of cursing them through supernatural means. The logic was simple and terrifying. If you argued with someone and they later experienced illness, crop failure, livestock death, or family problems, the timing could be interpreted as evidence that you had used magic to exact revenge. Even minor disagreements could be retroactively reinterpreted as the catalyst for supernatural attacks. Women who were known for speaking their minds, defending their interests, or refusing to back down from confrontations were particularly vulnerable. In a society that expected female submission and compliance, assertive women were already viewed as problematic. When misfortunes occurred after conflicts, their assertiveness was transformed into evidence of supernatural malevolence. Asterisk, asterisk, reason. 9. You were a skilled craftswoman. Asterisk, asterisk. Excellence in traditional crafts could paradoxically become suspicious. Women who were exceptionally skilled at spinning, weaving, pottery, or other crafts might be accused of supernatural assistance. If your textiles were unusually fine, your pottery exceptionally durable, or your needlework remarkably intricate, accusers might claim you had demonic help. The medieval mindset struggled to accept that some individuals were simply more talented or dedicated than others. Exceptional skill was often attributed to supernatural influence rather than natural ability combined with practice and dedication. Women whose work stood out from their peers risked being seen as unnaturally gifted This created a cruel irony where the very skills that made women valuable to their communities also made them vulnerable to persecution. Master craftswomen, who should have been celebrated for their contributions, instead learned to hide their abilities or deliberately produce inferior work to avoid suspicion. Asterisk, asterisk, reason. 8. You were caught. Sleepwalking, asterisk. Asterisk, sleep disorders and unusual sleep behaviors were poorly understood and often attributed to supernatural causes. If you sleepwalked, talked in your sleep, or had any other nocturnal behaviors that seemed abnormal, these could be interpreted as evidence of supernatural activity during the vulnerable state of sleep. Sleepwalking was particularly suspicious because it suggested that some external force was controlling your body while your conscious mind was absent. Witnesses who saw someone moving about at night in an apparent trance-like state often interpreted this as evidence of possession or supernatural manipulation. The things people said or did while sleepwalking were taken as evidence of their true supernatural nature. Incomprehensible mumbling might be interpreted as speaking in tongues or communicating with demons. Actions performed while sleepwalking could be seen as carrying out supernatural tasks or participating in invisible rituals. Asterisk, asterisk. Reason. 7. You had unusual eye color or heterochromia. Asterisk, asterisk. Physical features that deviated from the norm were viewed with suspicion, and eye color was particularly scrutinized. People with unusually light eyes, very dark eyes, or different colored eyes were often considered marked by supernatural forces. Heterochromia, having two different colored eyes, was seen as especially sinister. The eyes were believed to be windows to the soul, so unusual eye colors suggested an unusual soul. Light blue or green eyes in populations where brown eyes were common could be interpreted as signs of otherworldly influence. The intensity of someone's gaze, whether they looked directly at people or avoided eye contact, could also be used as evidence. Some accusations were based on the belief that witches could cast spells through their eyes, using the evil eye to curse their victims. People with striking or unusual eyes were more likely to be accused of possessing this supernatural ability to harm others through their gaze. Asterisk, asterisk. Reason. 6. You were too independent or self-sufficient. Asterisk, asterisk. Women who lived independently and managed to support themselves without male assistance were viewed as unnatural and threatening. If you could run your own household, manage finances, make important decisions, and thrive without a husband or male guardian, this independence itself was suspicious. Self-sufficiency suggested that you had access to resources or knowledge that other women lacked. How else could a woman survive and prosper on her own unless she had supernatural assistance? The idea that a woman might simply be intelligent, resourceful, and capable was apparently too threatening to accept. Independent women often owned property, made their own decisions about business matters, and had freedom of movement that married women lacked. This autonomy made them convenient scapegoats when communities needed someone to blame for various problems. Their lack of male protection also made them easier targets for accusations. Asterisk, asterisk, reason. 5. You were caught eating strange foods or had unusual dietary habits. Asterisk, asterisk, medieval diets were remarkably uniform within communities, so anyone who ate differently immediately stood out. If you consumed foods that others considered unusual, prepared meals in unfamiliar ways, or had dietary restrictions that seemed odd to your neighbors, you could find yourself under scrutiny. Women who foraged for wild plants, mushrooms, or other natural foods that weren't commonly eaten were particularly vulnerable. The suspicion extended to how you prepared food. If you used spices or herbs that weren't typical for your region, if you cooked at unusual times, or if your food seemed to taste better than expected, neighbors might assume you were adding magical ingredients. Even something as simple as preferring your meat cooked differently than others could be twisted into evidence of supernatural preferences. Fasting was equally problematic. If you abstained from certain foods for health reasons, personal preference, or even religious devotion beyond what was considered normal, this could be interpreted as following demonic dietary restrictions. Women who seemed to survive on less food than others, or who maintained their health despite apparent malnutrition, were sometimes accused of receiving supernatural sustenance. Asterisk, asterisk. Reason 4. You showed signs of mental illness or unusual behavior. Asterisk, asterisk. Mental health conditions that we understand today were completely misinterpreted in medieval times. Depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, or any condition that caused unusual behavior was often attributed to supernatural causes. If you talked to yourself, experienced mood swings, had periods of withdrawal or excessive energy, or displayed any symptoms that seemed abnormal, you risked being labeled as possessed or corrupted by evil forces. The medieval understanding of mental health was virtually non-existent. Behaviors that we now recognize as symptoms of treatable conditions were seen as evidence of moral corruption or supernatural influence. Women who experienced postpartum depression, seasonal affective disorder, or trauma responses were particularly vulnerable to accusations. Even temporary conditions could be dangerous. If you were going through a difficult period in your life and exhibited signs of distress, confusion, or unusual behavior, this could be permanently held against you. Recovery from mental health episodes might be interpreted as the demons leaving you, which paradoxically confirmed that they had been there in the first place. Asterisk, asterisk, reason. 3. You were involved in unusual births or deaths. Asterisk, asterisk. Midwives and healers weren't the only ones at risk when births or deaths seemed abnormal. If you were simply present during complicated deliveries, stillbirths, or deaths that seemed suspicious to the community, you could be accused of causing these tragedies through supernatural means. Even being the last person to visit someone before they died could make you a suspect. The medieval understanding of medicine was so limited that any unusual circumstances surrounding birth or death seemed potentially supernatural. If a baby was born with physical abnormalities, if someone died suddenly without obvious cause, or if multiple people in a family became ill, the community looked for someone to blame rather than accepting these as natural tragedies. Women who had the misfortune of being associated with multiple unfortunate events, even purely by coincidence, found themselves labeled as harbingers of doom. If several people you knew experienced losses or health problems over time, the pattern could be interpreted as evidence that you were cursing people or attracting evil forces. Asterisk, asterisk, reason 2. You were seen speaking to yourself or praying in languages others didn't understand. Asterisk, asterisk. Prayer and religious devotion were expected in medieval society, but the wrong kind of prayer could be dangerous. If you prayed in Latin and others around you didn't understand the language, they might assume you were reciting spells rather than legitimate prayers. Speaking to yourself while working, thinking aloud, or muttering under your breath could all be interpreted as incantations or conversations with invisible spirits. The paranoia extended to any foreign languages or dialects. If you came from a different region and spoke with an unfamiliar accent, used words others didn't recognize, or occasionally slipped into your native tongue, this linguistic difference could be seen as evidence of supernatural communication. Travelers, immigrants, and refugees were particularly vulnerable to these accusations. Even excessive religious devotion could backfire. If you prayed more frequently or intensely than others expected, if you knew religious texts unusually well, or if you displayed religious knowledge that seemed beyond your social station, this could be twisted into evidence that you had supernatural sources of information. Asterisk, asterisk, reason 1. You were simply a woman living in the wrong place at the wrong time. Asterisk, asterisk. Here's the ultimate truth about medieval witch accusations. Sometimes, no specific behavior or characteristic was needed. Being a woman during periods of social stress, economic hardship, or community crisis was enough to make you vulnerable. When crops failed, diseases spread, wars disrupted communities, or other disasters struck, people desperately needed someone to blame. Women were convenient scapegoats because they held less social power and had fewer legal protections. The witch hunt phenomenon was fundamentally about control, fear, and the need to redirect community anxiety toward vulnerable targets. Individual accusations might cite specific reasons, but the underlying dynamic was about punishing women who didn't fit narrow social expectations or who simply had the misfortune of being available when communities needed scapegoats. The most heartbreaking aspect of studying these accusations is realizing how arbitrary they often were. A woman could live her entire life as a respected community member, only to find herself accused during a period of crisis when neighbors were looking for explanations for their suffering. The same behaviors that were once ignored or even appreciated could suddenly become evidence of supernatural evil when circumstances changed. The documentation from witch trials reveals patterns that have nothing to do with actual supernatural activity and everything to do with social dynamics, gender roles, and community psychology. Women who were too independent, too knowledgeable, too different, or simply too convenient as targets found themselves caught in a system that was designed to find guilt rather than truth. Understanding these 25 reasons isn't just about learning historical trivia. It's about recognizing how fear, prejudice, and social pressure can transform normal human behaviors into evidence of imaginary crimes. The witch hunts represent one of history's most systematic examples of how communities can turn against their most vulnerable members when they're looking for simple explanations for complex problems. The women accused of witchcraft weren't practitioners of supernatural arts. They were herbalists, midwives, independent thinkers, skilled craftswomen, and individuals who simply didn't conform to restrictive social expectations. Their real crime was existing in societies that needed scapegoats more than they needed justice. These accusations reveal the deep-seated fears that medieval communities harbored about female knowledge, independence, and power. Every woman who knew too much, owned too much, or controlled too much of her own life was a potential threat to a social order built on female subordination. The witch hunts were ultimately about maintaining that order by terrorizing women into compliance. The legacy of these persecutions extends far beyond the medieval period. The same dynamics that drove witch accusations, the fear of female independence, the suspicion of women's knowledge, the tendency to blame women for societal problems, have echoes throughout history and even into modern times. Understanding how these accusations worked helps us recognize similar patterns when they emerge in different forms. What makes this history particularly chilling is how ordinary the accused women were. They weren't mysterious figures lurking in dark forests. They were neighbors, family members, community contributors who happened to possess knowledge, independence, or characteristics that made them convenient targets when their communities needed someone to blame for their problems. The witch trials weren't really about supernatural beliefs. They were about power, control, and the systematic oppression of women who dared to step outside the narrow boundaries society had drawn for them. Every woman who was accused, tried, and executed for witchcraft was ultimately a victim of a system that feared female autonomy more than it feared actual evil. As we continue to uncover more historical records from this period, the patterns become even clearer. The characteristics that made women vulnerable to witch accusations were precisely the qualities that made them valuable community members. Their knowledge, skills, independence, and strength were assets that communities desperately needed, yet these same qualities marked them as dangerous when social pressures mounted and scapegoats were required. The most tragic irony of the witch hunts is that they often targeted the very women who were most essential to their community's survival and well-being, destroying the knowledge and expertise that had been passed down through generations of women who had dedicated their lives to helping others. The ripple effects of these persecutions extended far beyond the individuals who faced accusations. Entire communities lost generations of accumulated knowledge when their healers, midwives, and wise women were driven out or killed. The oral traditions that had preserved medical knowledge, agricultural wisdom, and practical skills for centuries were severed, leaving communities poorer and more vulnerable than before. But here's where the story gets even more disturbing. The witch hunts weren't random explosions of superstition. They followed predictable patterns that reveal the calculated nature of these persecutions. Accusations typically spiked during times of economic hardship, political instability, or social upheaval. When harvests failed, when wars disrupted trade, when diseases swept through communities, that's when the finger-pointing intensified. Local authorities often encouraged these accusations because they served multiple purposes. Confiscating the property of accused witches helped fill depleted treasuries. Scapegoating vulnerable individuals redirected popular anger away from failed leadership. And maintaining fear kept populations compliant and dependent on those in power. The legal machinery that developed around witch trials was particularly insidious. Courts created procedures specifically designed to ensure convictions rather than determine truth. Torture was routinely used to extract confessions, and the legal standards of evidence were deliberately lowered for witchcraft cases. Accusations from children were accepted, Hearsay was treated as fact, and the burden of proof was effectively reversed so that accused individuals had to prove their innocence rather than having their guilt established. Perhaps most chilling was how the system incentivized false accusations. Informants were often rewarded with portions of confiscated property or granted legal immunity for their own crimes. Professional witch hunters traveled from town to town, earning fees for each conviction they secured. The economic incentives created a perverse marketplace where accusations became profitable enterprises. The geographic spread of witch hunts also reveals their manufactured nature. These weren't organic expressions of folk belief, but coordinated campaigns that followed trade routes and political boundaries. Areas under economic stress or political transition experienced the most intense persecution, while stable, prosperous regions often remained relatively unaffected. Women weren't the only victims, though they comprised the vast majority. Men who were accused typically fell into specific categories that threatened traditional power structures. Healers who competed with established physicians, religious dissidents who challenged church authority, or individuals who possessed knowledge that threatened existing monopolies, all faced potential persecution. The role of religious authorities in these persecutions was critical. While complex and often hip, some clergy genuinely believed in the supernatural threat posed by witches. Others clearly understood the political utility of these campaigns. Churchably selective about which supernatural records show that many religious leaders were remark claims they chose to investigate, focusing their attention on individuals who posed inconvenient challenges to their authority. The psychological mechanisms that drove these persecutions are particularly fascinating when examined through a modern lens. Communities experiencing trauma and uncertainty engaged in what psychologists now recognize as scapegoating behavior, projecting their fears and frustrations onto vulnerable individuals. The witch trials provided a framework for this projection that felt morally justified and socially sanctioned. Group psychology played a crucial role in escalating individual suspicions into community-wide hysteria. Once accusations began in a community, social pressure to conform often led neighbors to add their own testimonies, even when they had previously considered the accused person harmless or helpful. The fear of being seen as sympathetic to a witch, or worse, of being accused oneself, created cascading waves of denunciation. The testimonial evidence from witch trials reveals how ordinary social conflicts were reinterpreted through a supernatural lens. Disputes over property boundaries became evidence of cursing. Business competition was transformed into magical attacks. Personal grudges were elevated to cosmic battles between good and evil. The witch trials provided a socially acceptable way to settle scores and eliminate rivals. Children played a particularly tragic role in many accusations. Their testimonies were often accepted without question, and their imaginative accounts of supernatural encounters were treated as reliable evidence. Some communities experienced waves of accusations that began with children's stories and spiraled into mass persecution. The Salem witch trials represent perhaps the most famous example of how children's testimonies could destroy entire communities. The medical understanding of the time contributed significantly to the persecution. Conditions we now recognize as epilepsy, mental illness, or neurological disorders were interpreted as signs of possession or supernatural influence. Women experiencing hormonal changes during menopause, pregnancy, or other life transitions often displayed symptoms that were misinterpreted as evidence of witchcraft. The intersection of gender and age created particular vulnerabilities. Postmenopausal women were especially at risk because they no longer served the reproductive function that medieval society valued in women, yet they retained knowledge and often property that made them inconvenient. Young women approaching marriageable age could be accused if they were too independent or if their sexuality was seen as threatening to social order. The economic dimensions of witch hunts reveal their systematic nature. Accused individuals typically lost all their property, which was then distributed among accusers, court officials, and local authorities. This created powerful incentives for targeting individuals with valuable possessions. Widows with inherited property, successful businesswomen, and anyone who had accumulated wealth without male protection became prime targets. The legal innovations developed during witch trials had lasting impacts on jurisprudence, most of them negative. The acceptance of spectral evidence, testimony about supernatural visions that couldn't be corroborated, lowered evidentiary standards in ways that made fair trials nearly impossible. The use of torture to extract confessions became systematized and refined during this period, creating techniques that would be employed in secular persecutions for centuries to come. Regional variations in witch hunt intensity reveal the importance of local leadership and social structures. Areas with strong legal traditions and educated magistrates often experienced fewer persecutions than regions where local strongmen could manipulate the legal system for personal gain. The presence of universities, established medical communities, or other centers of learning sometimes provided protection against the worst excesses of witch hunting. The international dimensions of witch persecution show how ideas about supernatural threats spread across political translated and distributed throughout Europe, creating standard boundaries. Treatises on witchcraft were devised approaches to identifying and prosecuting suspected witches. This intellectual framework provided a veneer of scholarly authority to what were essentially systematic persecutions of vulnerable populations. The decline of witch hunts was gradual and uneven, influenced by changing legal standards, improved scientific understanding, and shifts in political power. The rise of more centralized legal systems reduced the ability of local authorities to conduct arbitrary persecutions. Improved medical knowledge began to provide natural explanations for phenomena that had previously been attributed to supernatural causes. However, the end of formal witch trials didn't immediately end the underlying social dynamics that had driven them. Communities continued to ostracize individuals who didn't conform to social expectations, though the methods became more subtle and the consequences less severe. The fear of female independence and knowledge persisted long after the last witch trial, manifesting in other forms of discrimination and control. The documentation that survives from witch trials provides an invaluable window into medieval and early modern social dynamics. Court records, witness testimonies, and official correspondence reveal not just the mechanics of persecution, but the fears, prejudices, and power structures that made such systematic injustice possible. Modern historians have worked to recover the stories of individual women who faced accusations, piecing together their lives from fragmentary records to understand who they really were beyond the supernatural characteristics attributed to them. These biographical reconstructions reveal a pattern of targeting women who possessed knowledge, property, or independence that threatened established social hierarchies. The psychological trauma inflicted by witch hunts extended far beyond their immediate victims. Entire communities lived in fear, knowing that any unusual behavior or unfortunate coincidence could trigger accusations. Women learned to suppress their knowledge, hide their abilities, and conform to restrictive social expectations to avoid suspicion. The impact on women's intellectual and professional development was devastating. Fields like medicine, herbalism, and midwifery that had been dominated by women were gradually taken over by male professionals who could practice without fear of supernatural accusations. This represented not just individual tragedy, but a massive loss of human knowledge and capability. The legacy of witch hunts continues to influence how we think about expertise, authority, and social deviance. The patterns of scapegoating, the fear of female knowledge, and the tendency to seek simple explanations for complex problems all echo through subsequent historical periods and into contemporary times. Understanding the true nature of witch accusations helps us recognize similar dynamics when they emerge in different contexts. The same social pressures that once led communities to persecute their healers and wise women can manifest in other forms of systematic oppression and scapegoating. The most profound lesson from studying witch hunts may be how quickly rational communities can descend into irrational persecution when fear, economic stress, and social pressure combine with inadequate legal protections for vulnerable populations. The ordinary people who participated in these persecutions weren't inherently evil, but they were caught up in social dynamics that made systematic injustice seem not only acceptable, but morally necessary. The witch hunts also reveal something deeply unsettling about how knowledge itself became weaponized against women. In medieval society, information was power, and power in female hands was inherently threatening. Women who accumulated too much practical wisdom, who understood the natural world too well, or who possessed skills that seemed beyond their station, found themselves walking a razor's edge between usefulness and suspicion. Take the fascinating case of women who could predict which crops would thrive in specific soil conditions. This knowledge, built through generations of careful observation and handed down from mother to daughter, was absolutely crucial for community survival. Yet when harvests succeeded where others failed, when these women's advice proved consistently accurate, neighbors began to whisper, "How could a simple peasant woman know things that even educated men couldn't predict?" Clearly, supernatural forces were involved. The paranoia extended to mathematical abilities. Women who could calculate quantities, measure ingredients precisely, or keep detailed accounts of household finances were viewed with suspicion. Numbers themselves seemed mystical to populations with limited education. A woman who could add, subtract, and work with fractions was obviously accessing knowledge beyond normal human capability. Asterisk, asterisk, the dangerous art of memory. Asterisk, asterisk. Here's something that will absolutely blow your mind. Having an exceptional memory could get you killed. Women who could recite long passages of text, remember complex recipes without writing them down, or recall detailed family histories were suspected of supernatural assistance. In an age where most people struggled with basic literacy, a sharp memory seemed impossible without demonic help. Storytellers faced particular danger. Women who entertained communities with elaborate tales, who could weave complex narratives and remember intricate details, were walking into potential accusations. Their ability to captivate audiences was reinterpreted as a form of enchantment, literally. The same skills that made them valued entertainers could be twisted into evidence of supernatural influence over human minds. The tradition of oral history, maintained primarily by women who served as living libraries of community knowledge, became a liability. These women preserved genealogies, recorded local events, and maintained cultural traditions through memory alone. But their vast stores of information seemed impossible for normal humans to contain. Surely, they were receiving supernatural assistance to remember so much. Asterisk, asterisk, the crime of emotional intelligence. Asterisk, asterisk. Medieval witch hunters were particularly suspicious of women who seemed to understand human nature too well. If you could read people's moods accurately, predict their behavior, or sense when someone was lying, you risked accusation. Emotional intelligence, that crucial skill for navigating social relationships, was reframed as supernatural mind-reading ability. Women who served as informal counselors, who helped resolve disputes or provided comfort during difficult times, found their empathy turned against them. Their ability to understand and respond to human emotions was seen as evidence of supernatural insight. The same compassion that made them valuable community members marked them as potentially dangerous. Even worse, women who could calm crying babies, soothe frightened animals, or ease tensions during conflicts were suspected of using magical influence. The idea that some people might simply be naturally gifted at understanding and responding to emotional needs was apparently too threatening to accept. Asterisk, asterisk. The suspicious nature of cleanliness. Asterisk, asterisk. Here's an irony that perfectly captures the impossible standards women faced. Being too clean could get you accused of witchcraft. In an era where hygiene standards were generally poor, women who maintained exceptional personal cleanliness or kept unusually tidy homes stood out in ways that bred suspicion. If your clothes were always clean when others were stained, if your home smelled pleasant when others were musty, if your hair appeared well groomed when others looked unkempt, neighbors might assume you had supernatural assistance with household management. The practical knowledge of soap making, the understanding of which herbs could freshen air or repel insects, the simple discipline of regular cleaning, all became potential evidence of otherworldly help. Women who seemed to accomplish household tasks too efficiently, who could clean, cook, and maintain their homes to standards that others couldn't achieve, faced scrutiny. Their domestic competence was reinterpreted as supernatural efficiency rather than skill, organization, and hard work. Asterisk, asterisk. The danger of innovation. Asterisk, asterisk. Any woman who introduced new techniques, improved upon traditional methods, or developed better ways of accomplishing common tasks risked immediate suspicion. Innovation itself was seen as potentially supernatural. If you figured out a more efficient way to preserve food, a better method for treating wool, or an improved technique for any common craft, your creativity could be your downfall. The medieval mindset struggled with the concept of human ingenuity. Progress and improvement were often attributed to divine intervention or demonic influence rather than human intelligence and experimentation. Women who demonstrated innovative thinking were particularly vulnerable because female creativity was seen as especially unnatural. Some of the most tragic cases involved women who developed solutions to common problems that plagued their communities. A woman who figured out how to prevent milk from spoiling as quickly, who invented a more effective way to protect crops from pests, or who discovered better methods for treating common ailments, could find her innovations used as evidence against her in witch trials. Asterisk, asterisk. The terror of teaching. Asterisk, asterisk. Education became a minefield for women during the height of witch hysteria. Teaching children to read, sharing knowledge about practical skills, or passing down traditional techniques could all be interpreted as spreading dangerous information. Women who served as informal educators, who helped preserve and transmit knowledge within their communities, faced increasing scrutiny. The act of teaching itself was viewed with suspicion when performed by women. How had they acquired the knowledge they were sharing? Why did they feel compelled to educate others? The assumption was that women who taught must have received their information from supernatural sources, since female learning was seen as unnatural. Particularly dangerous was teaching that seemed too advanced or comprehensive. Women who could instruct others in multiple subjects, who demonstrated broad knowledge across various fields, or who seemed to know more than their social position should have allowed, were prime targets for accusation. Their intellectual breadth was seen as evidence of demonic tutoring. Asterisk, asterisk. The peril of precision. Asterisk, asterisk. Attention to detail, particularly in women, was viewed as potentially supernatural. If you could work with exceptional precision, notice small changes that others missed, or maintain consistently high standards in your work, these qualities could be twisted into evidence of otherworldly assistance. Seamstresses who created perfectly even stitches, cooks whose measurements were always exact, craftswomen whose products showed remarkable consistency, all faced potential suspicion. Their dedication to quality and their developed skills were reinterpreted as supernatural perfection rather than human excellence achieved through practice and care. The paranoia extended to observation skills. Women who noticed details about weather patterns, animal behavior, or human health that others overlooked were suspected of supernatural perception. Their developed powers of observation, honed through years of careful attention to their environment, were seen as evidence of magical sight. Asterisk, asterisk. The burden of beauty in aging. Asterisk, asterisk. While we've discussed how both beauty and ugliness could trigger accusations, there was a particular paranoia about women who aged well. If you maintained your appearance, health, or vitality better than others your age, this longevity was often attributed to supernatural intervention. Women who seemed to age slowly, whose hair remained thick, whose skin stayed relatively smooth, or whose energy levels remained high in later years faced suspicion. The natural variation in how individuals age was interpreted as evidence of magical preservation. The idea that some people might simply have better genetics, health practices, or living conditions was apparently incomprehensible. The scrutiny was particularly intense for women who had children later in life, maintained active lifestyles as they aged, or continued to attract romantic interest past what was considered appropriate. Their refusal to conform to expectations of elderly female invisibility was seen as unnatural and potentially supernatural. Asterisk, asterisk. The crime of resourcefulness. Asterisk, asterisk. Self-sufficiency and resourcefulness, qualities that should have been celebrated, instead became marks of suspicion. Women who could make do with limited resources, who found creative solutions to problems, or who seemed to stretch their supplies further than others, were suspected of magical assistance. If your food stores lasted longer than your neighbors, if you could create useful items from scraps and discards, if you seemed to accomplish more with less, these practical skills were reinterpreted as supernatural multiplication. The ability to be frugal, creative, and efficient was seen as evidence of otherworldly help rather than human ingenuity. Particularly suspicious was the ability to find resources where others couldn't. Women who knew where to locate useful plants, materials, or food sources during times of scarcity were suspected of receiving supernatural guidance. Their knowledge of the natural environment and their willingness to explore and experiment were twisted into evidence of demonic assistance. Asterisk, asterisk. The danger of healing touch, asterisk, asterisk. Beyond herbal knowledge, women who seemed to have a healing touch faced particular scrutiny. If your presence seemed to comfort the sick, if people felt better after you visited them, if you had a calming effect on those in pain, these natural caregiving abilities were seen as potentially supernatural. The concept of bedside manner, the understanding that emotional support and gentle care could aid in healing, was interpreted as magical influence. Women whose patients recovered at higher rates, who seemed to ease suffering through their presence alone, or who could calm the dying, were suspected of supernatural intervention in the natural order of life and death. Even the simple act of holding someone's hand during illness, of providing comfort through touch and presence, could be reinterpreted as casting spells or channeling otherworldly forces. The human capacity for healing through compassion and care was transformed into evidence of supernatural power. Asterisk, asterisk. The suspicion of survival, asterisk, asterisk. Perhaps most cruelly, simply surviving when others didn't could mark you as a witch. During plagues, famines, or other disasters, women who remained healthy while others fell ill, who found ways to feed their families when others starved, or who seemed to navigate crises better than their neighbors faced accusations. Survival skills that should have been admired were instead seen as evidence of supernatural protection. The idea that some individuals might be better prepared, more knowledgeable about survival techniques, or simply luckier than others, was rejected in favor of supernatural explanations. Women who thrived during difficult times were suspected of making demonic bargains to ensure their well-being. The paranoia was so intense that some women deliberately made themselves appear sick or struggling during community crises to avoid suspicion. They learned to hide their competence, to downplay their success, and to appear as vulnerable as their neighbors to avoid accusations of supernatural assistance. Asterisk, asterisk. The fear of female networks. Asterisk, asterisk. Women who maintained strong friendships, who seemed to communicate effectively with other women, or who appeared to coordinate their activities too well, were suspected of participating in supernatural covens. The natural tendency of women to support each other, to share information and resources, was reinterpreted as evidence of organized witchcraft. Gatherings of women for any purpose became suspect. Sewing circles, communal cooking sessions, even informal conversations between female neighbors could be seen as potential witch meetings. The social bonds that helped women survive in male dominated societies were twisted into evidence of supernatural conspiracy. Women who seemed to know too much about what was happening in other households, who shared news too quickly, or who appeared to have information networks that crossed community boundaries, were suspected of supernatural communication. Their natural social intelligence and communication skills were seen as evidence of demonic coordination. Asterisk, asterisk, the ultimate impossibility. Asterisk, asterisk. What emerges from studying these 25 reasons is a picture of absolute impossibility. Medieval women faced a system where every positive quality could be used against them, where competence was suspicious, where knowledge was dangerous, and where survival itself could mark them for persecution. They couldn't be too beautiful or too ugly, too smart or too ignorant, too social or too isolated, too successful or too struggling. Every aspect of human existence had been weaponized against them. The witch hunts created a world where being a woman was itself a form of walking evidence, where any deviation from an impossibly narrow standard of acceptable behavior could result in accusation, trial, and execution. The true horror of this period wasn't the belief in supernatural evil. It was the systematic transformation of human virtues into evidence of guilt, the creation of a social system where the very qualities that made women valuable to their communities also made them vulnerable to destruction. These accusations reveal a society so threatened by female competence that it preferred to destroy its own knowledge base rather than accept women as capable, intelligent human beings. The witch hunts weren't about combating supernatural threats. They were about maintaining social control through terror, ensuring that women would never again feel safe enough to develop, demonstrate, or share their full capabilities. The legacy of these persecutions extended far beyond the immediate victims. They created a climate of fear that suppressed female achievement for generations, teaching women that competence was dangerous, that knowledge could kill, and that survival required the deliberate limitation of their own potential. The witch hunts didn't just destroy individual women, they attempted to destroy the very concept of female excellence. Understanding this history helps us recognize how systematically human societies can convince themselves that the very best qualities in certain groups of people are actually evidence of their danger to the community. The mechanics of scapegoating, the transformation of virtue into vice, the creation of impossible standards that ensure guilt regardless of behavior, these patterns echo through history in various forms. The women who faced these accusations weren't supernatural beings. They were healers, teachers, innovators, survivors, and community builders whose only crime was existing in a world that had decided their competence was too threatening to tolerate. Their real magic was their humanity, their intelligence, their resilience, and their refusal to be diminished even in the face of systematic persecution. The records from these trials paint a picture so bleak that it's almost impossible to comprehend how these communities functioned while living under such constant suspicion. But here's what makes it even more chilling. The system was designed to be inescapable. Once you were accused, the very act of defending yourself could be used as additional evidence of guilt. Asterisk, asterisk, the trap of self-defense. Asterisk, asterisk. If you protested your innocence too vigorously, you were clearly trying to deceive the court through supernatural manipulation. If you accepted the charges quietly, you were obviously guilty and showing demonic resignation. If you cried during your trial, you were attempting to gain sympathy through magical influence over emotions. If you remained stoic, you were demonstrating the unnatural coldness that came with supernatural corruption. The legal proceedings themselves were masterpieces of circular logic. Confessing under torture proved you were a witch who had finally admitted the truth. Refusing to confess despite torture proved you were a witch using supernatural strength to resist pain. Dying under torture proved you were a witch whose demonic masters had abandoned you. Surviving torture proved you were a witch whose supernatural powers had protected you. Even your relationships with other people became weapons against you. If other accused women named you during their interrogations, this was obviously evidence that you were part of their supernatural conspiracy. If they refused to implicate you, this proved you had such powerful magical influence that you could control their testimony even under torture. Asterisk, asterisk, the geography of accusation. Asterisk, asterisk. What's particularly fascinating when you map out where these accusations occurred is how they followed predictable patterns. Remote areas with limited outside contact experienced more intense persecution than cosmopolitan centers with diverse populations. Mountain villages, isolated farming communities, and regions cut off from major trade routes became hotbeds of suspicion. This isolation created perfect conditions for paranoia to flourish. In communities where everyone knew everyone else's business, any unusual behavior stood out dramatically. There were no strangers to blame for misfortunes, so neighbors turned on neighbors. The same intimacy that should have protected people instead made them more vulnerable to accusation. Conversely, major cities with their constant flow of travelers, merchants, and migrants offered more anonymity and protection. When genuine strangers were available to blame for problems, local residents were less likely to accuse each other. The diversity of urban populations also meant that unusual behaviors or appearances were less noteworthy. Asterisk, asterisk, the seasonal pattern of persecution. Asterisk, asterisk. Trial records reveal disturbing seasonal patterns in witch accusations. Spring brought fears about crop failures and livestock deaths, leading to accusations against anyone who might have cursed the growing season. Summer harvest time either vindicated or condemned those suspected of agricultural magic, depending on whether crops succeeded or failed. Autumn was particularly dangerous for women involved in food preservation, brewing, and preparation for winter. If preserved food spoiled, if beer went bad, or if families faced starvation during the cold months, blame often fell on women whose expertise should have prevented these problems. Winter brought its own terrors. Long nights trapped indoors with limited food and fuel created perfect conditions for suspicion to fester. Families crowded together in dark, cold spaces found themselves scrutinizing each other for signs of supernatural activity. The isolation and hardship of medieval winters turned homes into pressure cookers of accusation. Asterisk, asterisk. The economics of expertise. Asterisk, asterisk. Perhaps most tragically, the witch hunts often targeted women whose knowledge represented significant economic value to their communities. Master brewers whose techniques had been perfected over generations found their expertise transformed into evidence of supernatural assistance. Skilled textile workers whose innovations had improved local production faced accusations when their success made competitors jealous. The destruction of female expertise had devastating economic consequences that extended far beyond individual tragedies. When communities drove out or killed their most skilled practitioners, they lost centuries of accumulated knowledge. Techniques for brewing, weaving, dyeing, food preservation, and countless other crafts disappeared overnight when their masters were accused of supernatural methods. Some regions never recovered from these losses. Areas that had been renowned for particular crafts or products saw their reputations collapse when the women who maintained those traditions were persecuted. The economic decline that followed often triggered more accusations as communities searched for explanations for their sudden poverty. Asterisk, asterisk, the politics of accusation. Asterisk, asterisk. Local power structures played crucial roles in determining who faced accusations and who escaped suspicion. Women who challenged authority, who questioned decisions made by male leaders, or who demonstrated independence from traditional hierarchies were particularly vulnerable during periods of political tension. The timing of accusations often coincided with broader political conflicts. During wars, succession disputes, or other upheavals, local authorities used witch hunts to eliminate problematic individuals while appearing to protect community safety. Women who had accumulated too much influence, who owned strategic properties, or who posed inconvenient challenges to male authority found themselves facing supernatural accusations. Religious politics were equally dangerous. Women who demonstrated too much theological knowledge, who questioned religious authorities, or who practiced their faith with excessive independence could be accused of heretical witchcraft. Even excessive piety could backfire if it made male religious leaders uncomfortable with female spiritual authority. Asterisk, asterisk, the generational trauma. Asterisk, asterisk, the psychological impact of witch hunts extended across generations. Children who witnessed their mothers, grandmothers, or other female relatives face accusations grew up understanding that female competence was dangerous. They learned to suppress their own abilities, to hide their knowledge, and to conform to restrictive expectations of female behavior. This generational trauma had profound effects on the transmission of knowledge. Mothers stopped teaching daughters traditional skills that might attract suspicion. Grandmothers took their expertise to the grave rather than risk their descendants facing accusations. The oral traditions that had preserved female knowledge for centuries were deliberately broken to protect future generations. Young women learned to play stupid, to pretend ignorance, and to defer to male authority, even in areas where they possessed superior knowledge. This performed incompetence became so ingrained that many women genuinely lost confidence in their own abilities, internalizing the message that female expertise was inherently dangerous. Asterisk, asterisk, the role of professional accusers. Asterisk, asterisk, One of the most disturbing aspects of the witch hunt phenomenon was the emergence of professional accusers who made careers out of identifying supposed witches. These individuals traveled from community to community, offering their services to local authorities who wanted to root out supernatural threats. These professional witch hunters developed standardized techniques for extracting confessions, identifying supernatural marks on the body, and conducting trials that virtually guaranteed convictions. They were paid per conviction, creating powerful economic incentives to find guilt regardless of actual evidence. The existence of these professionals reveals how systematized and calculated the persecution became. This wasn't spontaneous community hysteria, but organized campaigns conducted by specialists who understood exactly how to manipulate fear, legal procedures, and social dynamics to produce the results their employers wanted. Asterisk asterisk. The International Network of Persecution. Asterisk asterisk. Witch hunting manuals were translated and distributed across Europe, creating standardized approaches to identifying and prosecuting suspected witches. These texts provided detailed instructions for conducting investigations, extracting confessions, and interpreting evidence. They transformed local suspicions into coordinated international campaigns. The sharing of techniques, legal precedents, and theoretical frameworks meant that similar accusations emerged simultaneously in widely separated regions. Women faced remarkably consistent charges across different countries, languages, and legal systems because the underlying methodology had been standardized and distributed. This international coordination reveals the calculated nature of the persecutions. Local communities weren't spontaneously developing similar paranoid beliefs. They were implementing imported techniques designed by authorities who understood how to channel social tensions into systematic oppression of vulnerable populations. Asterisk asterisk. The medical mystification. Asterisk asterisk. The medieval understanding of medicine created perfect conditions for supernatural accusations. Natural healing processes were poorly understood, making any recovery seem potentially miraculous or demonic. Women whose patients recovered at higher rates faced suspicion because their success seemed to exceed normal human capability. Conversely, women whose patients died despite treatment could be accused of deliberately causing those deaths through supernatural means. The same knowledge that enabled them to help people also made them convenient scapegoats when their efforts failed. They faced accusations whether they succeeded or failed in their healing attempts. The lack of scientific understanding meant that natural phenomena were consistently misinterpreted as supernatural events. Diseases that went into remission, injuries that healed unusually quickly, or pain that responded well to herbal treatments were all seen as evidence of otherworldly intervention rather than natural biological processes. Asterisk asterisk. The destruction of documentation. Asterisk asterisk. One aspect of witch persecutions that often goes unmentioned is how systematically they destroyed evidence of women's actual knowledge and capabilities. Personal records, recipe collections, medical notes, and other documentation maintained by accused women were typically destroyed as evidence of their supernatural activities. This deliberate destruction of documentation means that much of what we might have learned about medieval women's actual expertise has been lost forever. The very records that could have revealed the sophisticated knowledge these women possessed were burned as evidence of their supposed supernatural corruption. Libraries, workshops, and personal collections maintained by generations of skilled women disappeared overnight when accusations were made. The loss of this documentation has made it difficult for modern historians to fully understand the extent of female expertise that existed before the witch hunt period. Asterisk, asterisk, the linguistic transformation, asterisk, asterisk. The language used to describe women's activities underwent systematic transformation during the witch hunt period. Words that had previously carried neutral or positive connotations were redefined to suggest supernatural activity. Skilled became suspicious, knowledgeable became unnatural, independent became dangerous. This linguistic shift reveals how deeply the persecution penetrated cultural consciousness. The very vocabulary used to discuss female capabilities was weaponized against women. Terms that had once celebrated female achievement were transformed into accusations of supernatural corruption. The redefinition of language made it increasingly difficult for women to describe their own activities without triggering suspicion. Even positive self-description became risky when the words themselves had been contaminated with supernatural implications. Asterisk, asterisk, the legacy in legal systems, asterisk, asterisk. The legal innovations developed during witch trials had lasting impacts on jurisprudence that extended far beyond the persecution period. The acceptance of unreliable evidence, the use of torture to extract confessions, and the reversal of burden of proof created precedents that would be applied in other contexts for centuries. Many of the procedural violations that characterized witch trials became normalized in legal systems dealing with other types of cases. The erosion of defendant rights, the acceptance of coerced testimony, and the prioritization of conviction over truth became embedded in legal traditions that took generations to reform. The witch trials essentially served as laboratories for developing techniques of systematic oppression that could be applied to other vulnerable populations. The methods perfected during these persecutions were later used against religious minorities, political dissidents, and other groups that authorities wanted to suppress. Asterisk, asterisk, the resistance networks. Asterisk, asterisk, despite the overwhelming dangers, some women did resist the persecution system. Underground networks developed to help accused individuals escape, to hide evidence of their expertise, and to maintain forbidden knowledge despite the risks. These resistance efforts required extraordinary courage and careful coordination. Women developed coded languages for discussing their traditional knowledge, created secret methods for preserving important information, and established warning systems to alert others about impending accusations. These networks operated under constant threat of discovery, knowing that helping accused witches could result in their own persecution. The existence of these resistance networks reveals that many people understood the injustice of the persecution system even while it was occurring. Not everyone was swept up in the hysteria. Some individuals recognized that valuable community members were being destroyed based on fabricated charges and worked to protect them despite enormous personal risk. Asterisk, asterisk, the gradual awakening. Asterisk, asterisk. The decline of witch persecution wasn't sudden, but occurred gradually as various factors undermined the system's credibility. Improved scientific understanding began to provide natural explanations for phenomena that had previously been attributed to supernatural causes. Legal reforms raised the standards of evidence required for convictions. Economic considerations also played a role. Communities that had destroyed their most knowledgeable women began to suffer from the loss of essential expertise. The practical consequences of eliminating skilled practitioners became too obvious to ignore, forcing a reconsideration of the persecution system. Religious authorities who had initially supported witch hunts gradually recognized that the accusations were being used for secular purposes that had little to do with genuine spiritual concerns. The gap between theological theory and practical persecution became too wide to maintain credibly. Asterisk asterisk, the unfinished reckoning asterisk asterisk. What makes this history particularly relevant today is how incomplete the reckoning with these persecutions has been. While we acknowledge that the witch hunts were unjust, we've barely begun to understand the full extent of knowledge and expertise that was lost when these women were persecuted. The systematic destruction of female intellectual traditions had consequences that echoed through centuries. Fields that had been dominated by women were taken over by male professionals who often lacked the deep traditional knowledge that had been accumulated over generations. This transition represented not just individual tragedy, but massive cultural loss. Modern attempts to recover traditional knowledge often run up against the gaps created by the witch persecutions. Herbal medicine, traditional crafts, folk psychology, and countless other areas of expertise were severely damaged when their primary practitioners were systematically eliminated. The witch hunts represent one of history's most successful campaigns to suppress female intellectual achievement. They didn't just kill individual women. They attempted to kill the very idea that women could possess valuable knowledge, make important discoveries, or contribute meaningfully to human understanding. Understanding this history helps us recognize similar patterns when they emerge in different contexts. The same dynamics that once led communities to persecute their most capable women can manifest in other forms of systematic discrimination and suppression of expertise. The 25 reasons we've explored tonight aren't just historical curiosities. They're examples of how quickly societies can convince themselves that the very qualities they depend on in certain groups are actually evidence of those groups' danger to the community. This transformation of virtue into vice, of competence into threat, remains one of humanity's most persistent and dangerous tendencies. The women who faced these accusations weren't supernatural beings wielding mystical powers. They were human beings wielding human intelligence, creativity, compassion, and expertise. Their real magic was their refusal to be limited by artificial constraints on what women were supposed to know, do, or be. Their legacy lives on, not in the supernatural powers attributed to them by their persecutors, but in the very human qualities that made them valuable to their communities. Knowledge, skill, independence, creativity, resilience, and the courage to be themselves in a world that demanded their diminishment. Tonight, as we've walked through these shadows of history, we've seen how the systematic persecution of women's expertise impoverished entire civilizations. But we've also seen evidence of the indomitable human spirit, the networks of resistance, and the gradual triumph of reason over fear. The witch hunts ended not because the accusations were disproven, but because societies eventually recognized that they couldn't afford to continue destroying their own intellectual resources. The practical need for female expertise ultimately overcame the ideological commitment to female suppression. This history reminds us that the fight for human dignity, for the right to knowledge and achievement, regardless of gender, is never finally won. Each generation must choose whether to embrace human potential in all its forms or to find new ways to limit and suppress the capabilities that threaten existing power structures. The voices of the accused women echo across centuries, not in supernatural whispers, but in the very human demand for recognition, respect, and the right to exist without apology. Their real magic was their humanity, and that magic, thankfully, proved impossible to destroy completely. As we continue to uncover more about this dark period in human history, we honor these women not by romanticizing them as mystical figures, but by recognizing them as what they truly were: intelligent, capable human beings whose greatest crime was refusing to hide their light under the bushel that society had constructed for them. The witch hunts may have ended, but their lessons remain urgently relevant. They remind us what happens when fear overcomes reason, when scapegoating replaces justice, and when societies choose to destroy their own intellectual resources rather than challenge their prejudices about who deserves to possess knowledge and power. In remembering these women, we commit ourselves to ensuring that never again will competence be criminalized, expertise be demonized, or human potential be sacrificed on the altar of social control. Their memory demands nothing less than our vigilance against any system that would make virtues into crimes and turn our greatest strengths into evidence of our supposed guilt. The true horror of the witch hunts wasn't the belief in supernatural evil. It was the very human evil of systematic oppression dressed up as moral crusade. And the true miracle wasn't any supernatural intervention, but the survival of human knowledge, dignity, and hope, despite centuries of deliberate destruction. These 25 reasons stand as testament to both the depths of human cruelty and the heights of human achievement. They remind us that the same qualities that once marked women for persecution, knowledge, independence, creativity, and strength are exactly the qualities that societies need most. The witch hunts failed in their ultimate goal, not because of any supernatural protection, but because human excellence proved impossible to completely suppress. Knowledge survived in hidden forms, passed down through secret networks, preserved in fragments and whispers, until it could emerge again into the light. Tonight, we've explored not just the mechanics of persecution, but the resilience of the human spirit. We've seen how communities can turn against their most valuable members, but also how knowledge and dignity find ways to survive even the most systematic attempts at destruction. The women who faced these accusations gave us more than just cautionary tales. They gave us examples of courage, intelligence, and the refusal to be diminished by impossible circumstances. Their legacy challenges us to build societies that celebrate rather than criminalize human achievement, that protect rather than persecute those who dare to know, to excel, and to be fully human. The story we've just told isn't just ancient history. It's a blueprint that keeps getting reused, generation after generation, whenever societies need convenient targets for their fears and failures. The same psychological mechanisms that turned medieval communities against their healers and wise women have manifested in countless other contexts throughout history. Asterisk, asterisk. The modern echoes, asterisk, asterisk. What's genuinely terrifying about studying these 25 reasons is recognizing how easily they could be updated for contemporary times. Swap out witchcraft for any modern form of social persecution, and the patterns remain disturbingly familiar. The targeting of expertise, the punishment of independence, the transformation of competence into threat, these dynamics didn't disappear with the last witch trial. Consider how often we still see campaigns against people who know too much, who challenge accepted narratives, or who possess inconvenient expertise. The specific accusations change, but the underlying mechanism remains the same. Communities under stress still look for individuals to blame, still target those who stand out from accepted norms, still find ways to justify the destruction of their most capable members. The medical knowledge that once marked women as witches has modern parallels in how societies sometimes turn against their own experts during crises. The independence that made medieval women vulnerable finds echoes in contemporary attacks on anyone who refuses to conform to restrictive social expectations. The pattern is depressingly consistent across time and culture. Asterisk, asterisk. The psychology of scapegoating. Asterisk, asterisk. What we're really looking at when we study witch hunts isn't supernatural belief, but fundamental human psychology. When communities face problems they can't solve or understand, they have two basic options. They can admit their limitations and work together to address challenges collectively, or they can find someone to blame and convince themselves that removing that person will solve their problems. The second option is psychologically easier but practically disastrous. It provides immediate emotional relief without requiring the hard work of actually addressing underlying issues. It transforms complex, systemic problems into simple moral conflicts with clear villains and heroes. Most importantly, it allows communities to avoid taking responsibility for their own failures and shortcomings. This psychological tendency towards scapegoating isn't limited to medieval peasants. It's a universal human trait that emerges across all cultures, education levels, and historical periods. The sophistication of the society doesn't matter. What matters is whether that society has developed robust protections against the tendency to sacrifice individuals for collective psychological comfort. Asterisk, asterisk. The institutional framework of persecution. Asterisk, asterisk. One of the most chilling aspects of the witch hunts was how quickly normal, legal, and social institutions adapted themselves to systematic persecution. Courts that had functioned reasonably well for other types of cases developed special procedures that virtually guaranteed convictions in witchcraft trials. Religious authorities who preached love and compassion created theological justifications for torture and execution. The transformation happened so smoothly because the institutional framework was already there. All that was needed was to redirect existing systems toward new targets. The same legal procedures, religious doctrines, and social mechanisms that maintained order in normal times were weaponized against vulnerable populations during periods of crisis. This adaptability of institutions to serve oppressive purposes is perhaps more frightening than the persecution itself. It means that no society can assume its institutions will automatically protect vulnerable populations when social pressures mount. Institutions are tools that can be used for justice or injustice depending on the will of those who control them. Asterisk, asterisk, the economics of persecution. Asterisk, asterisk, following the money in witch hunts reveals motivations that had nothing to do with supernatural beliefs. The confiscation of property from accused individuals created powerful economic incentives for persecution. Communities could solve financial problems by seizing assets from people they labeled as witches. The professional witch hunters who traveled from town to town were essentially entrepreneurs in the persecution business. They understood market demand for their services and developed efficient techniques for supplying what local authorities wanted. The fact that they were paid per conviction reveals the commercial nature of what was supposedly a spiritual crusade. This economic dimension explains why witch hunts often coincided with periods of financial stress. When communities needed resources, accusing wealthy individuals of witchcraft provided a legally sanctioned method of wealth redistribution. The supernatural justification made what was essentially organized theft seem morally acceptable. Asterisk, asterisk, the gendered nature of expertise. Asterisk, asterisk, the overwhelming targeting of women in witch hunts wasn't coincidental. It reflected deep cultural anxieties about female knowledge and capabilities. In societies where women were supposed to be subordinate and dependent, competent women posed fundamental challenges to social order. The specific types of knowledge that made women vulnerable, healing, herbalism, midwifery, food preparation, textile production, were all traditionally female domains. These were areas where women had accumulated expertise over generations, where they possessed knowledge that men often lacked, and where their competence was essential for community survival. The witch hunts can be understood as systematic attempts to transfer control of these crucial knowledge domains from women to men. By destroying female expertise and replacing it with male professional authority, communities were essentially reorganizing their knowledge systems along gender lines that reinforced male dominance. Asterisk, asterisk, the cultural memory of persecution. Asterisk, asterisk, the impact of witch hunts extended far beyond their immediate victims through the creation of cultural memories that shaped behavior for generations. Women learned that displaying expertise was dangerous, that independence could be fatal, and that conformity was essential for survival. These lessons were passed down through families and communities, creating self-censoring behaviors that persisted long after the formal persecution ended. Women continued to hide their abilities, downplay their knowledge, and defer to male authority, even when the immediate threat had passed. The cultural trauma created by witch hunts fundamentally altered the relationship between women and knowledge. It transformed learning from an asset into a liability, expertise from a source of pride into a cause for fear, and competence from a virtue into a potential death sentence. Asterisk, asterisk, the deliberate destruction of knowledge. Asterisk, asterisk. Perhaps the most tragic aspect of witch hunts was how systematically they destroyed accumulated human knowledge. When communities eliminated their most skilled practitioners, they lost not just individuals, but entire knowledge traditions that had been built up over centuries. The oral traditions that preserved medical knowledge, craft techniques, and practical wisdom were severed when their carriers were persecuted. Written records maintained by skilled women were destroyed as evidence of supernatural activity. Entire libraries of human expertise disappeared overnight. This knowledge destruction had cascading effects that impoverished entire civilizations. Communities that had been centers of particular crafts or medical practices saw their reputations collapse. Regions lost their competitive advantages. Techniques that had taken generations to develop were lost forever. Asterisk, asterisk. The international coordination of oppression. Asterisk, asterisk. The spread of witch hunting techniques across Europe reveals how persecution methods can be systematized and distributed. The sharing of legal procedures, interrogation techniques, and theoretical frameworks created standardized approaches to identifying and prosecuting supposed witches. This international coordination shows how oppressive systems can achieve economies of scale. Rather than each community developing its own methods of persecution, authorities could import proven techniques from other regions. The standardization made the persecution more efficient, but also more predictable, and therefore more resistible. The existence of international networks for sharing persecution techniques suggests that similar coordination may exist for other forms of systematic oppression. Understanding these networks is crucial for developing effective resistance strategies. Asterisk, asterisk. The role of mass psychology. Asterisk, asterisk. Individual witch accusations often escalated into community-wide hysteria through well-understood psychological mechanisms. Once accusations began, social pressure to conform led neighbors to add their own testimonies, even when they had previously considered the accused person harmless. The fear of being seen as sympathetic to a witch, or worse, of being accused oneself, created cascading waves of denunciation. Communities became trapped in spirals of accusation where each new testimony seemed to confirm previous suspicions and justify further persecution. These mass psychological events weren't unique to medieval times. Similar dynamics can be observed in various historical contexts where communities have turned against their own members. Understanding these patterns is essential for recognizing and interrupting them when they begin to emerge. Asterisk, asterisk. The resistance networks. Asterisk, asterisk. Despite the overwhelming dangers, networks of resistance did develop to protect accused individuals and preserve forbidden knowledge. These underground systems required extraordinary courage and careful coordination, but they proved that not everyone was swept up in the persecution hysteria. The existence of these resistance networks reveals that many people understood the injustice of what was happening even while it was occurring. They recognized that valuable community members were being destroyed based on fabricated charges and worked to protect them despite enormous personal risk. Studying these resistance efforts provides insights into how individuals and communities can protect vulnerable populations during periods of systematic persecution. The strategies developed by medieval resistance networks offer lessons that remain relevant for contemporary contexts. Asterisk, asterisk. The gradual recognition of injustice. Asterisk, asterisk. The decline of witch persecution occurred gradually as various factors undermined the system's credibility. Improved understanding of natural phenomena reduced the need for supernatural explanations. Legal reforms raised evidentiary standards. Economic costs of destroying expertise became too obvious to ignore. Most importantly, Some communities began to recognize that the persecution system was being manipulated for secular purposes that had little to do with genuine spiritual concerns. The gap between theological justification and practical persecution became too wide to maintain credibly. This gradual awakening suggests that even deeply entrenched systems of oppression can be overcome when enough people begin to question their fundamental assumptions. The process is slow and often incomplete, but it demonstrates that societies can learn from their mistakes and develop better approaches to handling social tensions. Asterisk, asterisk, the unfinished legacy, asterisk, asterisk. What makes this history particularly relevant today is how incomplete the reckoning with these persecutions has been. While we acknowledge that witch hunts were unjust, we've barely begun to understand the full extent of what was lost when these knowledge traditions were destroyed. The systematic elimination of female intellectual traditions created gaps that persist to this day. Fields that had been dominated by women were taken over by male professionals who often lacked the deep traditional knowledge that had been accumulated over generations. Modern attempts to recover traditional knowledge often encounter the voids created by these historical persecutions. The loss of expertise wasn't just individual tragedy, but collective impoverishment that affected entire civilizations for centuries. Asterisk, asterisk, the contemporary relevance, asterisk, asterisk. Understanding the mechanics of historical persecution helps us recognize similar patterns when they emerge in contemporary contexts. The same psychological and social dynamics that drove witch hunts continue to operate in modern societies, though they may target different groups and use different justifications. The transformation of competence into threat, the scapegoating of vulnerable populations during times of stress, the institutional adaptation to serve oppressive purposes, these patterns remain relevant for understanding contemporary forms of systematic discrimination and persecution. The witch hunts offer a case study in how quickly rational societies can descend into systematic oppression when fear overcomes reason and when institutional protections for vulnerable populations prove inadequate. Asterisk, asterisk. The human capacity for both cruelty and resilience. Asterisk, asterisk. Perhaps the most important lesson from studying witch hunts is understanding the dual nature of human societies. The same communities that produced systematic persecution also generated networks of resistance, preservation of knowledge, and eventual recognition of injustice. This duality suggests that the outcome of social crises isn't predetermined. Communities facing stress and uncertainty can choose to scapegoat vulnerable populations, or they can choose to work together to address underlying problems. The choice depends on leadership, institutional protections, and cultural values. The women who faced persecution during witch hunts demonstrated remarkable resilience in preserving their knowledge, supporting each other, and maintaining their dignity despite impossible circumstances. Their example provides inspiration for contemporary resistance to systematic oppression. Asterisk, asterisk, the ongoing struggle for human dignity. Asterisk, asterisk. As we reach the end of our journey through these dark corridors of history, what emerges isn't just a catalog of medieval paranoia, but a blueprint for how quickly human societies can turn against their most valuable members. These 25 reasons weren't random acts of superstition. They were systematic attacks on female knowledge, independence, and expertise that reveal humanity's most dangerous tendency to destroy what it fears to understand. The women we've remembered tonight weren't wielding supernatural powers. They were wielding something far more threatening to oppressive systems: human intelligence, creativity, and the courage to refuse diminishment. Their legacy challenges us to recognize these patterns when they emerge in new forms, to protect those who dare to know and excel, and to ensure that competence is celebrated rather than criminalized. Because the real magic these women possessed, their knowledge, resilience, and refusal to be silenced, remains the most powerful force for human progress we have.